Good afternoon, everyone. Well, afternoon where we are. We are at the DPE Summit in San Francisco. I am here at the Build Propulsion Lab. I'm Trisha G. I should have mentioned that to begin with. And I'm here to talk to Aubrey and Roberto from Netflix about testing and basically why testing is important. So give me an overview of what your talk was about today.
Okay, sure. First of all, my name is Aubrey Chipman, and I'm part of the developer productivity team, specifically the JVM ecosystem team over at Netflix, as is my teammate.
Roberto Perez. We are part of the JVM ecosystem team, and we own the whole build, package, publish experience for JVM users at Netflix and JDK lifecycle. So testing experience is one of the most important things we are looking into at this point.
Yes, and our talk title is How Improving the Testing Experience Goes Beyond Quality, a Developer Productivity Point of View.
I didn't get a chance to see all of your talk. I was very sad about that. So now you can tell me all about it. We were talking a bit about it last night, about like how testing is a kind of pain point that is, I personally think, is still under-recognized in the industry. I think that we tend to think tests take a long time, and that's just kind of the reality, and there's not really much we can do about it, and we just kind of have to suck it. But your talk was kind of like, that's not necessarily the case. We can do something about tests that take a long time, right?
Definitely so. Do you mind if I start?
Absolutely.
Okay. So we, first of all, we're taking a look to figure out how much of a pain point this actually is. Is this something that we needed to take a look at, or just something that we kind of felt like, yeah, this could be a lot better? So once we started looking at the actual data, we saw that over all of our builds that are running, 88% of the time is spent during tests, which is a lot of time that we're spending. If there's any improvements that can be made in the space, then we definitely want to do so. So we started looking for what kind of tools we would want to implement, what things we could roll out for users, what things we could do on a project level or at a bigger scope.
Yeah, and I think to complement, it's also worth noticing that people tend to avoid not only writing tests or running them locally. They decide that because it's very painful, as you said, I'm just going to push everything to my CI infrastructure and wait for the feedback, and that can be hours, minutes, you name it. But still, like, it's not highly productive. Like, let alone the numbers. It's really about experience. As an engineer, the last thing you want to have is I push something, then I go do something else. Once I come back, everything is broken, and probably you already switch, right? Like at some point, your mind is in another task or just in some random thing that you have to do. So going back into that flow state that we call is relatively hard. And that's why we have been trying to understand this more. And another piece of context is Netflix has this multi-repo approach where engineers have multiple repos in their org to the point that we have outgrown ourselves to more than 3,000 repositories. So that means that we cannot do build gatekeeping. We try to enable them, but at the same time, it's really hard to understand, is this thing slow because it's meant to be, or is it slow because it's a poorly written test or bad maintenance, things like that. So it's hard, but we try to do our best.
Right. So and there's so many things I wanted to follow up on there. I don't really know where to go first. The first thing I was thinking about was the CI thing, because I've definitely seen, you can run your unit test locally, and that's usually fast, and you're great, and you feel great, and you just push it to CI, and then you think CI can take care of all the complicated, long integration tests or UI tests or whatever. But you're absolutely right, because then you go off and do something else, and then when something breaks in CI, then you're like, oh God, now I've got to go back and find out what went wrong there. Which leads me on to another thing. I'm going to distract myself. There are loads of things I want to talk about. And what if that failure was a flaky test or a flaky build? Because then you end up down this pit of despair of trying to debug something that probably wasn't your fault. And so to me, I think the key is trying to get the feedback as soon as possible, not just push it up to CI because there's more machines there and it can run things more effectively. But you were talking in your talk about, I think you called it remote test running or remote test. Yeah, so that you can run it in remote test execution. So you can run it locally, but not locally, because it's not local. You run it from your local machine, but you run it over multiple agents.
That's correct.
So then you're not pushing the problem to CI. You're not necessarily getting in someone else's way. Do you want to talk a little bit more around that?
Yeah. Sure. So definitely for this part of it, we want to make sure that we're getting feedback back to the developers as soon as we possibly can. So we want people to be running their builds locally as much as possible. Just don't wait until you are hitting the CI environment and see what it looks like with merging and integration, like at that point. Because if you're working on a feature, you want to see, is it working? Is it working with all the various kinds of things that are there? And so test distribution, as you brought up, really helps with this aspect because you're going to have consistency between what you're running locally and the way it will get run in CI. We have sometimes run into issues, for example, with infrastructure related differences. Like there's different memory on one aspect, there's different hardware requirements, Docker runs differently depending what your setup is. Maybe there's a different dependency that's used that's just very OS specific. And if you're using test distribution, definitely one of the things that it gives you is that consistency between your local environments and your CI environment being run in the same way. But there's still lots of other benefits too.
Yeah, also determinism. So think about the local experience just for a bit. Your computer will be different than mine, in a sense. Team members might acquire a Docker, an M1, an M2 Linux machine. So the whole experience locally is way different for every single engineer. So an engineer might be happy with their 10 seconds for running a test, but the other one might spend hours or minutes just because some nature of their ecosystem they are working on. And at Netflix, we don't standardize or we don't force you to use a particular machine type. Right. So you are free to say, you know what, I'm a Windows user. I'm just going to use Windows. That's up to you. You decide to have your own toolchain. Good for you. When you introduce something like remote test execution, you make a better use of compute resources also because if you think about this particular thing between local and CI, most likely your local machine might be more powerful than the CI ones. Because people are looking into how can I reduce the cloud cost of operation.
Right.
And one of the usual things to do is, okay, we are going to reduce the fleet, or we're going to reduce the instance type and running these particular agents. And at some point, your local machine is more powerful, right?
Right.
When you do test distribution, it's more deterministic in a way that it's based on historical data. It will tell you what would be the optimal way to schedule that work. So you will have multiple partitions, you will send that information, and you will run those things in parallel. So parallelization is not limited to the local resource or the compute resource, but more about the availability of agents. And those could be really lightweight, right? Because at the very end, as Java test or JVM test shouldn't be that big,
right,
in a sense. And even if you need a lot of memory or CPU compute, it's way cheaper to probably have a short running process than an actual long running machine taking over like multiple work units.
Right, which leads me to something else I wanted to ask you about actually, which is related. So this sounds great because now you can run your tests in parallel and you can save time and you get consistency and reproducibility. But some of this must come at a cost. So like, what's the cost? What do you need to do in order to make sure that your tests are able to be run this way?
Yeah, I think that other than just opting into it, which by itself is very simple to do, one of the things that our users will see is that this doesn't currently work at Netflix under all circumstances. So what we have in a lot of our test infrastructure is, it might not be applicable to everyone else, but what we do is we have a bunch of integration or smoke tests that will go out and reach to other live running services, for example. And so those are things that might be in your test environment, but they require specific kinds of identity and access management, specific kinds of networking, specific authentication handshakes that are on there. And so this is already set up where you're working on your local development machine and your machine knows that you are you. And so you are opted into those security policies already. For the CI machines, this is handled in a particular way. But for the test distribution agents, these are different agents that are running those same kinds of builds, but they don't have that networking permission set up quite yet. So that's something that we're collaborating closely on with other teams, especially with security, to make sure that we're getting this handled in a really nice, safe way so that everyone can benefit from distributing the tests, and it has all of the identity and access set up appropriately.
Yeah, you're going to elaborate a little bit more. If you look at the Gradle test execution, the remote test execution that we use, there are two major things that you get out of it. One is you need to use a unique platform.
Yes.
So that means you are standardizing also. it's important to know that it's not about you should write your test with JUnit, you should use the engines. So if you have Scala, if you have Kotlin, if you are using Spock, Selenium,
yeah.
you can work with that. You can work on top of that as long as you have a proper engine. And if you look at the JUnit platform repository, there are like at least 15 of them supporting multiple frameworks, so it's not a limitation. And the second one is, it really helps you to stop designing tests in a bad way. Things like tests shouldn't rely on each other, for example. That doesn't work on remote text execution out of the box because, I mean, it's deterministic, but it doesn't mean that all the test classes will get scheduled with the same engine. So that means that you should be more careful on how you design the test from the first time, and it's also better for maintenance, code maintenance of your test suite. So it really pushes you a bit into, be a better developer when it comes to write your test closer to production.
Yeah, that's kind of what I wanted to drive towards, really, because I think a lot about writing tests. So I always think that, I feel like we don't treat them like production code. I feel like we often treat them like a sort of afterthought. And I feel like some of these sorts of tools kind of encourage us strongly to write better tests. We have to have better separation. They have to be more isolated. We have to do the things we said that we were going to do with our tests and not have them dependent upon each other, because if they are going to run on separate agents, then you can't have this test dependent on this test. They're entirely different things. So do you see the benefits not only for, presumably you get big speed improvements over running them in parallel, but do you also see benefits in terms of improvements in quality or improvements in the way tests are written?
So the way I like to think about this one is that if it's easy for people to be running their tests, if it's easy to have a kind of best approach, we're just letting people do the things that are going to benefit them kind of naturally. And this is especially evident over at Netflix, where we have a lot of automation in place that not everyone immediately thinks about, like why this would have overarching effects. So when we talk about, are people going to be writing more tests? Like ideally so, that gives them the correct amount of confidence to deploy their library, their service appropriately. And they don't need to do tests later down the line, but instead they can catch things nice and early before it even gets to a deployment to a test environment, for example. And a lot of the automation that we have relies on that contract of, if your tests go green, then we can auto merge things in for you, because you as a developer have said, this is our contract. If these all go green, then you can merge stuff in, and then it's going to get released and then run through additional verifications later. But if people aren't comfortable writing tests because they take too long, or they're flaky, or they're troublesome, or it's a big headache, then people might not opt into that. And that contract that we very much rely on has a lot of difficulty.
Right. And I want to talk about flaky tests because, I love flaky tests. Because you were saying the contract, if everything goes green, then it's good to go. And flaky tests are like the opposite of that, because it goes green and then it doesn't go green and then it does go green. And then, so like, how do you deal with flaky tests at Netflix?
Good question. At this point, I think we're only working on surfacing the problem.
Right.
We don't have a solution for it in a sense. Like we don't have the agency to go and fix everybody's builds. The fact that we work in this distributed, eventually consistent distributed monolith, that's how we like to call it, because you have multi-repos, but at the very end, people do binary integration. It just makes it so difficult for folks in our position to write automation to go and fix this. Mm-hmm. And even if you can, really only the engineers owning the project might have the proper context on how to, go and fix it, understand the root cause of the problem. Of course, we can probably get some sense on, okay, these are network issues, and probably you're missing some network permissions. But at the very end, project owners should be the ones accountable for. So we are working more into, okay, we are going to surface to you, we're going to try to incentivize to do this. And one of the carrots to get into that is that once you get a buildable repository, let's say, we can do things like deliver change automatically for you. We can get you from, let's say, Spring Boot 3.0 to 3.1 without you engineering writing any single line of code, because we know that your test suite is good. But if you give me the bad signal, well, there's no way for me, platform owner or platform provider, to do that change for you. So I will go and ask you, hey, can you migrate this manually? And that's when probably they will see the value.
I really like that. When I worked at the place where I used to work with Dave Farley, and we had a lot of automated tests, and we actually had a number of flaky tests. And I wasn't in any position of responsibility, but flaky tests drive me insane. So what I would do is I would like come up with a list of flaky tests, and I would come into work in the mornings with chocolate. And I'd be like, whoever fixes the flaky test gets a chocolate bar.
Oh, that's excellent.
But I actually prefer your idea of, you actually earn yourself less work if you can put this bit of work in here. Things can be done automated. You can have your continuous delivery pipeline all doing what it's supposed to do. And that's the problem with flaky tests. It gets in your way, but you don't always see it, right? You might see a failing test, but surfacing the idea that this is a flaky test is step one, right? Because you need to fix the flaky tests.
It is. And then to add on to the way that we're surfacing it, we're able to see which tests are flaky over in the Gradle Enterprise dashboard system for looking at flaky tests. So you can see like, oh, what does it look like overall for all of our repositories? What does it look like for this one project? What does it look like for this one class? Those kinds of things. And we've had a number of asks in the past to make that information more visible to our users because it's really valuable for them. But they say, I go to my terminal, I check out my source code, I view it in the browser and whatever it is over there. I go to my CI tool, I go to my deployment tool, and they're all different windows that I need to have open. How do I link them all together? So we're definitely also using different integrations, like being able to put your build scan on every one of your builds. So you can just go click it. And then at the very end of your build, we have a little custom text that says, you want to go check out your flaky builds? Click this link. And then it populates it with the search fields for people. Similarly, on people's build scans, we're able to hook into the APIs to generate the build scan itself and then have custom tags on there so that people can go from any build scan that they have to click the link, see all of their flaky tests that they have for their entire project. And so we're hoping that will also help people to be able to see that this data exists. We'd really like you to take a look at it because it'll make your life much, much easier.
I've been talking to a few people today about, so I used to work at JetBrains, so I have a big thing about IntelliJ IDEA. And I'm like, if only this was in the IDE, right? Because it would be nice if it could somehow talk to Gradle Enterprise, for example. And when you run a test, it goes, okay, it passed, but Gradle Enterprise says this is one of your flaky tests. Maybe you might want to look at that. I think that, no one I know is working on that, but you're talking about visibility. And to me, as a developer, having it in the IDE is ultimately in your face. Like you can't avoid that. You don't have to go to a different dashboard. You get, this test doesn't work sometimes. Like, oh, maybe I should do something about that.
I really like that. That's excellent.
So you should do that. And then let us know how you did it.
Yeah, I think that's super cool. Because definitely if you have a flaky test that's running and it failed, you're like, why did it fail?
Right.
Did I change a thing?
Right, exactly.
Like, oh, this one is notoriously flaky.
Yes.
Would you like to fix it?
Which would be cool, I think.
I like that.
I think I have to wrap up because I have to go back on stage again. But I've got so much more I need to talk to you about. Is there anything you want to mention before we wrap up? Anything you want to talk about that I didn't cover?
Just pre-testing as your class citizen before even there are things that you can do at a project level. Like it's not important the scale really. Like you can go and invest within your team, within your project, within your org company. And there are many things that you can do to make the experience better than don't take multi-year investments.
Right.
Really, as an engineer, there are things that if you are curious enough, you can jump in and make just not only your life, but everyone's lives in your team better when it comes to running tests. So it definitely pays off. We have seen folks that are very, very interested in the build aspects. They spend time on it and they get super recognized by their peers.
Right.
Because they become like, oh, this person really cares about our tool chain. So yeah, definitely spend time understanding why things are slow. Don't wait for getting frustrated when you see that something is going wrong. It's better at that time than months later when everything is just worse. Right?
And I like your point about the thing I like about DPE is that if you fix something that's causing frustration for one developer, it almost always fixes it for a whole bunch of developers. It's not just you. It's like, so if you fix a flaky test, you help everyone. And I really like that because then suddenly there's a motivation of, it's not just, I don't just have to put up with it. If I do this, I help everyone and we're all going to be that much more effective. Any more closing thoughts?
Very much enjoying the event.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for having us.
Oh, you are very welcome.
Delight.
Thank you for coming. That's it. I don't even know how to wrap these things up. Thank you very much for coming and I hope we'll hear from you soon.
Excellent.